The gun was already drawn when Alice Grady looked up from the soil. Not at her. At the man crouching beside her in the dust of the Colorado Territory, the man who had spent the last 3 weeks trying and failing to teach her anything about the land he called his own. The gun belonged to a deputy named Colton Reeves, a broad-shouldered brute with a badge that caught the afternoon sun and threw it back like a taunt. The barrel was pointed at Ira McCree's chest, and Ira was not moving. He stood very still with his hands loose at his sides and his jaw tight, and his eyes on Alice in a way that told her this was not the first time someone had pointed a weapon at him, but it might be the first time he had something worth staying alive for. "Step away from him," Reeves said to Alice. "He's wanted, Miss, step away and nobody gets hurt." Alice did not step away. She stood up slowly, brushing the red dirt from the knees of her dress, and she looked at the deputy with the kind of calm that had always unsettled people who expected her to be frightened. She was 24 years old. She had crossed 1,100 miles of open wilderness in a rattling stagecoach with 3 strangers, and a case of dried botanical specimens that her mother had told her was completely unnecessary. She had arrived in Cimarron, New Mexico Territory in the summer of 1878 with a letter of introduction, a surveying notebook, and the reasonable assumption that the man she had agreed to marry through a correspondence arrangement was exactly the kind of quiet, agreeable fellow who would leave her to her work. She had been wrong about that. Wrong in a way that had rearranged everything she thought she understood about herself. "Ira McCree has not committed any crime in the last 6 months, Alice said, and her voice was perfectly even. "The warrant you are holding was issued under a name he does not use anymore, for a property dispute that was settled in the spring. You have no legal authority to detain him." Reeves stared at her. Then he looked at Ira. Ira said nothing, but something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite despair. "How does a woman from Philadelphia know a single thing about New Mexico warrant law?" Reeves demanded. Alice bent down and picked up the small sprig she had been examining before the interruption. She turned it between her fingers. "This is Artemisia ludovicina," she said. "White sagebrush. It grows in the disturbed ground at the edge of your horse's hoofprints, deputy. Your horse is tired. It has been ridden hard for at least 2 days, which means you did not receive new orders from Santa Fe recently, which means you are operating on an old warrant." She looked at him steadily. "I suggest you ride back and verify before you make a very serious mistake." The silence lasted a long and brittle moment. Reeves lowered the gun. It was not a surrender, exactly. It was a man who had just discovered that the woman he thought needed saving was the most dangerous person in the immediate vicinity, and that the danger she posed was entirely legal and entirely correct. When he finally wheeled his horse and rode back toward the ridge, Alice did not watch him go. She was looking at Ira. Ira was looking at her with an expression she had seen building for weeks without knowing what to call it. Now she thought she knew. "You knew about the warrant," she said. "I knew about the warrant," he confirmed. "You were not going to tell me." "I was not going to tell you." She held his gaze for a moment that stretched long and warm across the afternoon. Then she looked back down at the white sage in her hand and said, "Tell me now." And so he told her, all of it. The parts he had been keeping locked behind his dark past like something he was ashamed of, and something he was afraid of in equal measure. And that was where the real story began. Not in the moment the gun was drawn, but in the 3 weeks before it, and in the particular, irreversible way that Alice Grady had walked into Ira McCree's life and refused to be what either of them had expected. She had arrived in Cimarron on the 14th of June, 1878, 3 days late because the stage had broken an axle outside of Raton Pass, and the driver had required the passengers to help push the vehicle through a mudslide, which Alice had done without complaint while also collecting 6 specimens of flora she had never seen before and pressing them into the back of her notebook with a piece of wax paper. She had been arranged to marry a rancher named Edward Pollard. The arrangement made through the respectable offices of a Santa Fe correspondence bureau that her cousin had used with great success the previous year. Edward Pollard was 41, recently widowed, owner of 312 acres east of Cimarron, and described in his letter as steady, God-fearing, and in need of a capable woman who could manage a household and raise children with proper discipline. Alice had written back from Philadelphia with a description of herself that was accurate in every particular, and which she suspected he had not read carefully enough. She was 24, the daughter of a botanist who had died when she was 17, educated beyond the reasonable expectations of the territory, fluent in Latin nomenclature for most of North American plant life, and not afraid of hard work. She had also mentioned, in the third paragraph of her second letter, that she intended to continue her botanical survey work after marriage and expected her husband to respect that. Edward Pollard had written back that he appreciated a woman with practical skills. She had chosen to believe that was an agreement. She was, again, wrong. But that particular wrongness had not yet revealed itself on the morning she stepped down from the stagecoach into the dusty main street of Cimarron and blinked against the glare of a Colorado Territory summer. The town was smaller than she had imagined, which was saying something because she had imagined it quite small. There was a general store, a hotel of questionable structural integrity, a land office, a saloon, and a blacksmith. The street was unpaved and smelled of horse and dry heat. The sky above it was the specific shade of blue that exists only in high desert country, so deep and clear and vast it made a person feel simultaneously significant and entirely irrelevant. Alice had looked at that sky for a full 30 seconds before remembering to look for the man who was supposed to be meeting her. There was no Edward Pollard. There was, however, Ira McCree. He was leaning against the post of the hotel porch, arms crossed, watching her with dark eyes under the brim of a hat that had seen better years. He was perhaps 30, lean in the way of men who spent most of their lives outdoors, with a face that was weathered and particular, the kind of face that was difficult to read at a glance and revealed more the longer you looked. He wore work clothes, not dress clothes. He had not made any special effort for the occasion of her arrival. "Miss Grady," he said, pushing off the post. "Yes." "Ira McCree. I work the adjacent parcel to Pollard's. He sent me to collect you." He paused. "He sends his apologies. One of his mares foaled early, and he could not leave." Alice considered this information. She considered the fact that the man she was supposed to marry had chosen not to meet her stage. She considered the man currently standing in front of her who had the decency to look as if he found this situation marginally embarrassing on his employer's behalf. "I see," she said. She looked at him for a moment. "You are not a hired hand." He had not told her that. She had simply read it in the way he stood, the way his eyes moved, the fact that his boots were well maintained even if his hat was not. "No, ma'am," he said carefully. "You own your land outright." A pause. "I do." "Then he owes you a considerable favor for this errand." She picked up her case, the heaviest one, before he could offer to take it, and looked down the street. Which direction? That had been the beginning. Not romantic, not electric, at least not in a way she recognized in the moment. Just two people assessing each other with the careful attention of people who had both learned that assumptions were expensive. The ride out to the Pollard Ranch was 12 miles of open country, and Alice spent most of it looking at everything. Ira McCree drove the wagon and said almost nothing, which suited her fine. She had a notebook out within the first mile. "What are you writing?" he asked at the 3-mile mark, apparently unable to contain himself. "Observations," she said without looking up. "Of what?" "The flora, the soil composition, the way the grassland transitions at the creek boundary there." She nodded toward a line of cottonwoods maybe a 1/4 mile north. "That drainage runs east. The vegetation pattern shifts in the last 100 yards. You can see the Chamisa giving way. There will be a secondary spring somewhere in that draw, probably running alkaline." He looked at where she was pointing. Then he looked at her. She did not notice. She was writing. He did not speak again for another mile. Then, "There's a spring in that draw. It runs alkaline. Nobody from town knows about it." Alice looked up then, and for the first time she looked at him with something other than efficient assessment. "How do you know the alkalinity?" "The plants," he said simply. "The ones with the gray-green leaves cluster around it. They can handle salt." She stared at him. "Saltgrass," she said, "distichly spicata." He looked at her with an expression that was the emotional equivalent of a man finding a door in a wall he had assumed was solid. "I called it saltgrass too," he said. "I just did not know the Latin." That, in retrospect, was when it had actually started. Not the moment she stepped off the stage. Not the moment she took her own bag. The moment she named the plant and he recognized it. Edward Pollard was exactly as described. Steady, God-fearing, practical. He was also a man who had made up his mind about women before Alice Grady walked through his door, and was not going to revise that understanding simply because the evidence contradicted it. He was kind enough in the early days, and Alice found that his ranch was genuinely impressive, well-organized land, good soil, 36 head of cattle, and a kitchen garden that was struggling in ways she could immediately diagnose and fix. She fixed the kitchen garden in her first 4 days. Replanted the tomatoes, added a nitrogen-fixing legume border, redirected the watering trench. Pollard watched her do it and said, "Oh." On the 5th day, he told her he expected her to leave her notebooks in the house. "I beg your pardon," she said. "When you ride out with me on ranch work," he said, with the careful patience of a man explaining something obvious, "a notebook is not appropriate." "I am surveying the native grassland for potential overgrazing patterns," she said. He looked at her as though she had said the words in a foreign language. "You are riding out with me," he repeated, "as my intended wife." Alice had looked at him for a long moment. She had recognized in that moment something that she had half known from the letters and chosen to ignore. That Edward Pollard's vision of a capable woman was a woman capable of the things he already valued. And that the things she valued, her work, her notebooks, the specific and irreplaceable act of moving through the world with full attention, were not among them. She had taken the notebooks. She had brought them on every ride after that. She had been polite about it and firm about it, and the argument had continued in that low, grinding way that some arguments do when neither party is willing to change their fundamental position. Ira McCree came to the Pollard Ranch for the first time officially on the 10th day to discuss a fence line dispute, a minor matter of 300 yards of post placement that had apparently been contentious for 2 seasons. He sat at Pollard's kitchen table and discussed it with the formal courtesy of neighbors who respected each other without especially liking each other. Alice had served coffee and then sat down at the other end of the table with her notebook, which caused Pollard's jaw to tighten briefly. Ira had looked at the notebook, then he had looked at Alice. After the fence line was settled and Ira was preparing to leave, he passed Alice at the door and said, quietly enough that Pollard could not hear, "There is a patch of something growing by the north fence post that I cannot identify, if you wanted to walk out that way tomorrow morning." It was not quite an invitation. It was more like a door left open. Alice went. She found the plant he had mentioned. It was Macarantha tanacetifolia, tansy aster, which was not unusual except that it was growing in a soil band that suggested a mineral seep below the surface. She crouched over it for 20 minutes with her lens and made 3 pages of notes. Ira McCree sat on the fence rail 10 yards away and watched her work with the expression of a man who had expected to be mildly amused and was instead entirely engaged. "What is it?" he asked. She told him. She told him what it meant about the soil. She told him what grew near it and why, and what that implied about the watershed, and how the pattern she was seeing in his north pasture indicated a geological feature that might be significant for his water rights in a dry year. Ira listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not look out at the distance or check the position of the sun to gauge the time. He listened the way a person listens when they are learning something that matters to them. When she finished, he said, "I have been reading this land for 8 years and I missed that." "You were not looking for it," she said. "What were you looking for?" She thought about this. "Everything," she said finally. "I am always looking for everything." He was quiet for a moment. The morning was clean and bright around them, the mountains blue and enormous to the west, the grassland moving in a slow rhythm under the wind. "That is a hard way to live," he said, not unkindly. "It is the only way I know how," she said. They began to meet at the fence line every few days. It was not secret. Exactly, the Pollard land and the McCree land shared a long boundary, and there was regular legitimate business between them. But there was also something that was not business, something that grew in the spaces between the plant names and the soil observations, and the long, comfortable silences that neither of them commented on. Alice learned in those weeks that Ira McCree had come to New Mexico territory from Texas when he was 22, that he had worked 3 years as a cattle hand before buying his parcel outright with money he never explained the source of, which was the seed of the warrant she would encounter later. She learned that he had taught himself to read from a single Bible and a 6-year run of an agricultural journal that a previous owner had left in the cabin. She learned that he knew the land the way she knew her specimens, intimately, specifically, with a love that was the particular variety of love that only develops through years of careful, repeated attention. She also learned things that were darker and more complicated. She learned that there had been a partnership, early in his years in the territory, with a man named Doyle Keegan, and that Doyle Keegan was the reason for the warrant. She learned this not from Ira but from the general store owner's wife, a garrulous woman named Mrs. Hennessy, who seemed to view the sharing of information as a civic duty. Keegan was a land speculator, Mrs. Hennessy said, wrapping Alice's order of oats with a vigor that suggested she was channeling emotion into the task. Came in from Kansas, bought up water rights, then sold them at twice the price to ranchers who needed them to survive. McCree worked with him for a season. Whether he knew what Keegan was doing or went along with it willingly, nobody can prove one way or the other. But when the territorial marshal came looking, Keegan disappeared and McCree was the one left standing. She tied the parcel with a snap. Charges were never formalized. But the warrant stayed on the books under an old name McCree used to go by. Ira Holt, he was called then. Alice took her oats and thought about this all the way home. That evening she asked Pollard carefully about Ira's past. Pollard's expression shifted in a way that told her something before he spoke. "Stay away from McCree," he said simply. "He is your neighbor," she said. "You have dealings with him regularly. That is different." "Different how?" Pollard looked at her with the patience of a man being asked to explain something that he considered self-evident. "He is not a safe man to be close to," he said. "He has a dark past and he has hidden motives, and people who deal too closely with him end up in trouble." Alice set down her fork. "What hidden motives?" "I do not know exactly," Pollard admitted, "but a man who changes his name once will change it again." She recognized the shape of this argument. It was the shape of an argument that was not really about Ira McCree at all. It was the shape of a man who was beginning to feel that his intended wife was finding something on the McCree property that she could not find on his, and who had decided that the safest response was to forbid the proximity. Alice did not agree with this assessment. She had met men with hidden motives. Ira McCree was not one of them. He was, in her estimation, a man with a buried past and a complicated history and a very thorough understanding of alkaline soil drainage, none of which constituted a character defect. She went to the fence line the next morning. Ira was already there. He was looking at the ground with the focused attention she had come to recognize, and when she approached he said, without looking up, "There is something wrong with this grass stand here." She looked at where he was indicating. She crouched down. "The root zone is damaged," she said. "Below the surface. Something moved through here." She pressed her fingers into the earth and felt the disturbed layer. Heavy, consistent pressure. Last winter, maybe early spring. "Cattle," he suggested. "Too regular for cattle, they scatter." She stood and looked at the line of damage extending north. "This is a road that was used and then abandoned. The grass is coming back, but the root damage is persistent." He stood beside her, looking at the same invisible line in the earth. I never saw anyone using a road here. It would have been before your time, she said. She followed the line with her eyes. Where does this lead? If it runs true north, the abandoned Vargas homestead. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was something between them in that moment that was not about the road or the grass at all. It was the specific quality of two people who have discovered that they think the same way, who approach problems with the same combination of physical attention and intellectual curiosity, who find in each other a mirror that is simultaneously validating and disturbing, because of how clearly it reflects something you did not know you were searching for. "Show me the Vargas homestead," she said. "That is McCree land now," he said carefully. "I know, Pollard would not approve. I know that too." He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass and lifted a strand of her hair, and she did not push it back. "Come Sunday afternoon," he said finally. "I will show you the whole north section." That Sunday, Alice told Pollard she was going to sketch the creek flora. She was not lying exactly. She fully intended to sketch creek flora. She just did not specify which creek. Pollard grunted and went back to his ledger, and Alice walked north with her notebook and her lens, and her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do. The north section of the McCree land was extraordinary. She had suspected it might be, from the plant indicators she had been reading for weeks, but suspicion and reality are different things. The draw she had predicted from the wagon on her first day turned out to be a full spring-fed hollow, sheltered by a sandstone overhang, with a microclimate that was at least 5 degrees cooler than the surrounding land. The plants in it were unlike anything she had seen elsewhere in the territory. There were 3 species she could not immediately identify, which was significant because she could immediately identify almost everything. Ira watched her from 20 feet away, letting her move through the hollow at her own pace, and she lost track of time entirely. When she finally looked up, the light had changed. "It is late," she said. "I know," he said. He had made coffee on a small fire while she worked, and he handed her a cup without asking if she wanted it. She did want it. She was cold from the shade of the hollow and warm from the work, and the coffee was strong and bitter and exactly right. "Ira," she said, because she had started using his given name somewhere in the previous 2 weeks without either of them marking the moment. "I need to ask you about the warrant." The stillness that moved through him was the kind that is not physical. He did not change his posture. He just became very still inside, the way a landscape goes still before weather. "Where did you hear about that?" he said. "It does not matter where. What matters is whether it is resolved." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. "The property dispute it stemmed from was settled in April," he said. "I have the paperwork from the land office. But the original warrant was issued under my old name and the resolution was filed under my current one. And in this territory, that means the warrant technically still shows as active until someone with sufficient authority reconciles the 2 records." Alice thought about this with the methodical care she gave everything. "Who issued the original warrant?" "Territorial Marshal's office in Santa Fe." "And the resolution?" "Filed by me with the local land office." "Those are 2 different branches," she said. "Yes, and nobody has communicated between them." "Apparently not." She looked at him. The firelight was doing something complicated to the planes of his face, and she made herself focus on the problem rather than that particular distraction. "I can write to the Territorial Marshal's office," she said. He looked at her sharply. "Why would you do that?" "Because I am good at writing letters," she said. "And because you have 8 years of water records for this whole northern section that you have never told anyone about. And the territory needs that information, and I would like you to still be present and alive to share it." The look he gave her then was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. It lasted only a moment before his face settled back into its familiar economy of expression, but she had seen it and she did not forget it. It was the look of a man who had been carrying a secret burden long enough that he had forgotten other people could see it, suddenly realizing that he had been seen. "Alice," he said. "Yes. You came here to marry Pollard." "I came here to marry someone," she said. "I thought it was Pollard." The fire snapped. Somewhere in the hollow, something small moved through the undergrowth. The mountains to the west had gone violet with the end of the afternoon. "You should not be here," he said, but it did not sound like a complaint. "I am here," she said. That is the only relevant fact. The walk back to the Pollard property line was quiet, but not the empty kind. It was full, the way a room is full when two people in it are thinking about the same thing and have not yet decided whether to say it. At the fence, she stopped. "Thank you for the hollow," she said. "Thank you for the tansy aster," he said. She laughed. It surprised them both. It was a real laugh, the kind that comes before you can decide whether it is appropriate, and it scattered into the evening air and did something to the distance between them. She went back to the Pollard house and wrote 3 letters that evening. One to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe, one to the land office in Cimarron requesting the official resolution record, and one to a colleague of her late father's at the University of Pennsylvania who had connections in territorial survey work, and who she suspected could apply institutional pressure if necessary. Pollard found the letters the next morning before she could take them to town. The argument that followed was the worst one yet, but it was also the most clarifying. He did not rage. That was not his character. He was cold and certain and spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had made a decision and was informing her of it. "You are interfering in matters that are not your concern," he said. "You are going to the McCree property without my knowledge. You are writing letters to government offices on behalf of a man you have known for 3 weeks. He set the letters on the table between them. This arrangement will not work." Alice looked at the letters, then at him. "No," she agreed. "It will not." The silence that followed had a particular quality, the quality of something ending that both parties had known was not right, and the strange combination of relief and loss that comes with that kind of ending. "I will arrange for you to stay at the hotel," he said, with the decency that was genuinely part of his character even if his vision of marriage was not compatible with hers. "Until you can make arrangements." "Thank you," she said. She was in the hotel by afternoon, her cases arranged in the small room with the window that faced west. She sat at the small desk and mailed her letters, and then sat with her hands folded and looked at the territorial sky and thought about what she had done. She had walked away from the only reason she had come to New Mexico territory. She had no income here, no family, no claim to any property. She had a case of botanical specimens, several notebooks of observations, and a slowly developing set of feelings for a man who had a warrant for his arrest and who had never said a single explicitly romantic word to her. She was, she decided, the least frightened she had been since her father died. Ira McCree came to the hotel the following morning. He stood in the lobby with his hat in his hands in the way of a man who has thought carefully about what he is going to say and has then abandoned his prepared speech at the last moment. "I heard you left Pollard's," he said. "News travels," she said. "Are you all right?" She looked at him. He was asking with his whole face, not just the words, and she appreciated that about him, that there was no gap between what he meant and what he expressed, only a slight delay for composure. "I am very well," she said. "I have been thinking about the alkaline spring. I believe the mineral composition may be unusual enough to be of interest to the Territorial Geological Survey. I would like to conduct a proper analysis." He stared at her. "You were just released from an engagement," he said carefully. "Yes, and you are thinking about the spring." "I am also thinking about other things," she said, meeting his eyes with the directness that she had been told all her life was too much, too forward, too unfeminine. "But the spring is a concrete and actionable concern. The other things require more information before I can draw conclusions." Something happened to his face that she had been learning to read. The careful neutral surface shifted, just slightly, the way water surface shifts when something stirs below it. "What kind of information?" he said. "The kind," she said, "that I expect you will provide when you are ready to." He stood there for a moment longer. Then he settled his hat back on his head and said, "I am riding out to the north section this afternoon, if you want to come." "I want to come," she said. The afternoon was one of those late June days in the high desert that exist on the edge of something, the sky too blue, the air too clear, the light on the grass with the quality of something that will be remembered. They worked the hollow together, Alice collecting and noting and naming, Ira watching and occasionally pointing to something he had noticed that she had not yet reached. There was a particular rhythm to it, a call and response of attention, like two musicians who had never formally played together but who had both studied the same music until it was in their bones. "That one," Ira said, nodding toward a small cluster of silver-leaved plants at the base of the sandstone overhang. Alice had already crossed to it and was crouching down. "Hymenopapus filifolius," she said. "Fine-leaf woolly white. It likes exactly this combination of thin soil and protected exposure. The alkalinity of the spring is actually providing the specific mineral balance it needs. I have only ever seen them in one other place," he said, coming to crouch beside her. "3 years ago west of here in the Sangre de Cristo foothills. That is a logical population distribution," she said, leaning in closer to examine the flower head structure. Their shoulders were nearly touching. "The soil geology connects. If you drew a line between the two occurrences, you might find a continuous." She stopped. She had found a third species she could not immediately name. "What?" he said. "I do not know this one," she said, and the awe in her voice was unmistakable. She sat back on her heels and looked at the small, pale-flowered plant with the absolute attention of a person encountering something genuinely unknown. Ira was watching her face rather than the plant. "You sound happy," he said. "I am very happy," she said. "An unidentified species is the best possible thing. Most people find the unknown frightening," he said. He was not talking entirely about plants. She looked at him then. They were very close in the crouch, and the late afternoon light was coming sidelong through the sandstone entrance of the hollow, and she was acutely aware of both the plant in front of her and the man beside her. "I know," she said. "I have been told many times that I should be frightened of things I am not frightened of." "What are you frightened of?" he asked. His voice was quiet. It was the most personal thing he had directly asked her. She thought about this genuinely. "Being wrong about something that matters," she said. "Making an assessment that is too confident and missing something important." He was quiet. "Are you making an assessment?" he asked. "I am always making assessments," she said. "About the land, about the people in it." She looked at the pale flower rather than at him. "I have been making one about you since the day you picked me up from the stage. And I have not missed anything," she said. "I do not think." The silence that followed was the most charged one yet. She could feel his nearness the way you feel the nearness of a heat source, not uncomfortable but undeniably present, a warmth that the afternoon air alone could not account for. "Alice," he said, and the way he said her name was different from any of the previous times. It was not a question or a caution. It was just her name said as if saying it was an act in itself. She turned to look at him directly. He kissed her. It was not a tentative or experimental kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been making his own assessment for 3 weeks and had arrived at his conclusion with the same careful, thorough method she used for everything. It was warm and certain and entirely appropriate to the moment, and she kissed him back with the same quality of decision, not impulsive, not reckless, but absolutely deliberate. When they drew back, both of them were very still for a moment. "I should tell you the rest of it," he said. "The Keegan business, all of it." "Yes," she said. "You should." He told her there in the hollow, sitting on the warm sandstone with the unknown plant between them and the light going golden through the entrance. He told her everything. He had been 23 and naive about territory law, and Keegan had been persuasive, and the arrangement had seemed like an ordinary land investment partnership. He had not known, initially, that the water rights Keegan was trading had been obtained by misrepresentation, by filing claims against parcels whose legal owners were absent or unable to navigate the territory's deliberately complicated registry system. The victims had been predominantly Hispanic families, the descendants of original land grant holders whose rights predated American territorial governance, and who had been systematically disadvantaged by a legal system that was new and foreign to them. When Ira had understood what Keegan was doing, fully understood it, not just suspected it, he had confronted Keegan and dissolved the partnership. Keegan had subsequently gone to the marshal claiming Ira was the primary agent. There was enough documentary entanglement to make the claim plausible. Ira had spent a year under active investigation, changed his name to distance himself from Keegan's network, and finally cleared himself through a combination of documented evidence and the testimony of several of the affected families who distinguished his conduct from Keegan's. But the warrant stayed on the old name, he said. Because no one connected Ira Holt to Ira McCree, she said, officially, and Reeves found the old name. Reeves works for a land office in Santa Fe that Keegan had connections to, Ira said. Keegan has been in Sonora for 2 years, but he still has people here, people who benefit from keeping me off balance. Alice processed this. The warrant is not about the original dispute, she said. It is a harassment mechanism. That is my belief. Then we need to not just resolve the warrant, she said, thinking as she spoke. We need to document and expose the mechanism. We need to make it costly for Keegan's remaining people to pursue you. Ira looked at her with that expression she had begun to treasure, the one where he was fully surprised and fully trusting at the same time. You are talking about taking on a connected land speculation network, he said. I am talking about writing very good letters to very specific people, she said, which is what I do. He was quiet for a moment. Then quietly and simply he said, Why are you doing this for me? She looked at him with the directness that she had long since stopped apologizing for. Because I have been looking at this land for 3 weeks, she said, and at you, and the conclusion I have drawn is that you are someone worth the effort. She paused. Also because injustice makes me angry, and I have a professional acquaintance at the Territorial Land Commission who owes my late father a debt of gratitude. That is very practical reasoning, he said. I am a very practical person, she said. He took her hand, not urgently, not dramatically, just took her hand and held it and looked at the pale, unknown flower between them. I would like to call this plant something, he said. I have to analyze it properly first, she said. I need to check my reference materials and write to Dr. Mortensen in Philadelphia. It may take some time to establish whether it is a true undescribed species or an unusual variant. While you are doing that, he said, will you stay? She understood what he was asking. He was not asking about Cimarron or the hotel. He was asking about the territory, about the proposition of proximity, about the thing that had been growing between them in the way the tansy aster grew in disturbed ground, opportunistic and vivid, and more permanent than either of them had planned. Yes, she said, I will stay. The weeks that followed were the most productive and most complicated of Alice Grady's life, and also the most interesting, and also the most frightening in the particular way she had identified the way of caring about an outcome before you know what it will be. She wrote letters, 6 of them in the first week, to strategic recipients, the Territorial Marshal's Office in Santa Fe, the Federal Land Commission, the Territorial Land Court, her father's colleague at the university, her own cousin who had married a man with connections to the New Mexico Territorial Legislature, and a journalist at the Santa Fe New Mexican who had published a series of articles on land fraud 2 years earlier, and who she suspected would find the Keegan network worth revisiting. She conducted her botanical work with renewed intensity, partly because it was what she did, and partly because the Spring Hollow had turned out to be genuinely extraordinary. The unidentified plant proved, after 2 weeks of careful analysis with her reference materials, to be a variant she could not match to any described species. She prepared a complete specimen description, pressed samples, made detailed sketches, and sent a package to Dr. Mortensen in Philadelphia with the full documentation. His response arrived 6 weeks later and confirmed her hypothesis. It appeared to be an undescribed species, likely endemic to the specific microhabitat of the hollow. The formal process of species description would take time and the involvement of institutional taxonomy, but the initial assessment was electrifying. She was working on the documentation when Ira found her in the hotel room, papers spread across the small desk and 3 candles burning despite the late hour. "It is after 10, he said from the doorway. "I know," she said without looking up. "You have not eaten since midday." "I will eat in a moment." He went downstairs and came back with bread and cheese from the hotel kitchen and set them beside her papers and did not comment on the fact that she continued writing while she ate. That was when she understood, with the completeness that her best analyses always had, that she was thoroughly and irreversibly in love with Ira McCree. It was not the kiss in the hollow, although that had been significant. It was not any single dramatic moment. It was this: a man who brought her food without asking if she wanted it because he had observed her closely enough to know that she needed it, and who did not interrupt her work to make a point of his own thoughtfulness. She finished her sentence, set down her pen, and turned to look at him. He was sitting in the chair by the window looking out at the dark street. "Ira," she said. "Yes." "I love you." He turned from the window. He looked at her for a long moment with his whole face open in a way she had worked to earn over weeks of patient attention. "Alice," he said, "I have been in love with you since you told me the Latin name of the saltgrass." She laughed again, the real kind, and he crossed the room and sat beside her on the edge of the desk, and they stayed like that for a long while, close and warm and entirely decided. The responses to her letters arrived over the following 3 weeks in a cascade of increasing significance. The Federal Land Commissioner wrote back with what appeared to be genuine interest in the documentation she had provided regarding Keegan's original water rights fraud scheme. The journalist at the Santa Fe New Mexican wrote back with several pointed questions and a note that he had been looking for exactly this kind of follow-up. The Territorial Marshal's office wrote back, most importantly, with a formal acknowledgement that the warrant issued against Ira Holt and the resolution record filed by Ira McCree described the same individual, and that pending a brief review period, the active warrant status would be rescinded. That letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late July. Alice was at the land office picking up the official documentation when the deputy clerk handed it to her, and she read it standing at the counter and felt something release in her chest that she had not known she was holding. She rode out to the McCree property immediately, which she was doing regularly enough by now that nobody in town pretended to be surprised by it. The land office clerk had, in fact, simply handed her the letter without question, as if it were obvious that Alice Grady was the appropriate recipient of documents pertaining to Ira McCree's affairs. She found him repairing the east fence, shirtless in the afternoon heat, and she called his name from 20 yards out because she could not wait, and when he turned she held up the letter. He came toward her and took it and read it and stood very still for a moment with the paper in his hands. "It is done," she said. He looked up. The expression on his face was something she had not seen before, not the careful neutral, not the surprised and trusting look, not even the open love she had seen increasingly often in private moments. This was simpler than any of those. This was a man who had been carrying something for years and was putting it down. He folded the letter, put it in his shirt pocket, and walked toward her and took her face in both his hands and kissed her with the full weight of 8 years of quietly managed burden and 3 months of falling helplessly in love with the most unexpected woman he had ever met. She kissed him back with equal sincerity. When they separated, she was slightly breathless and entirely unwilling to be apologetic about it. "There is a question I have been building toward," he said. "I know," she said. "I would like to ask it properly," he said, "not standing in a field with fence tools on the ground." "All right," she said. "Tonight," he said, "at the Hollow." She went back to the hotel and changed her dress, which she recognized was the most traditionally feminine thing she had done since arriving in the territory, and she walked out to the Hollow in the long evening light with her heart doing the thing that had become familiar over the previous months, that high warm certainty that was the most frightening and most right feeling she had ever had. Ira was at the hollow with a fire already laid and a blanket on the flat sandstone and 2 cups of coffee. The hollow in the evening was something else entirely from the daytime. The light filtering through the entrance was amber and deep, and the unknown plant was in full flower, pale and extraordinary in the shadow of the overhang. He was waiting for her, and when she came in he stood and crossed to her and took both her hands and looked at her with everything he had stopped hiding weeks ago. "Alice Grady," he said, "you came to this territory to marry a man, and instead you catalogued 147 native plant species, identified a possible new endemic, exposed a land fraud network, and dismantled a 7-year-old warrant." He paused. "And somewhere in the middle of all of that, you made this land make sense to me in a way it never did before, even though I have been living on it for 8 years. Another pause. "I would very much like you to keep doing all of those things, here, with me, as my wife if you are willing." Alice looked at him. She looked at the hollow around them, the impossible small flowers in the shadow, the mineral spring she had predicted from a moving wagon, the land that had been waiting to be read by someone with the right attention. "I should tell you," she said, "that if I am your wife, I will still go to the hollow on my own when I am working. And I will still write letters to government offices when I believe an injustice needs addressing. And I will likely identify several more plants that you have been looking at for years without knowing the Latin." "I am counting on all 3, he said. "Then yes," she said. "Yes, Ira McCree, I will marry you." They were married in Cimarron in August of 1878 by the circuit preacher, with the hotel owner and his wife as witnesses, and Mrs. Hennessy, from the general store, who had not been invited, but appeared anyway with a cake, and the justification that she had been informally matchmaking for months and deserved representation. Edward Pollard did not attend, but he sent a brief formal note of congratulation that Alice found genuinely gracious and wrote a brief formal response to, and they maintained a civil neighborly relationship thereafter that was exactly appropriate to the situation. The Keegan Network story broke in the Santa Fe New Mexican in September, a long and detailed piece that named names and documented transactions and referenced the Federal Land Commissioner's ongoing inquiry. Doyle Keegan, still in Sonora, did not return to New Mexico territory. His remaining agents in Santa Fe quietly resigned their positions or moved on. The deputy named Colton Reeves left the territory entirely in October, which Alice noted without particular satisfaction, but also without any sympathy. The letters Alice had written in the spring established something she had not entirely intended: a reputation. The Federal Land Commissioner wrote again in November to ask if she would be willing to consult on the documentation standards for the Territorial Botanical Survey, which was in the process of being formalized under the auspices of the newly established New Mexico territorial government. She wrote back yes. Then she wrote back yes to 2 more requests, one from the university contact and one from the Territorial Land Court regarding native plant indicators in water rights disputes. By the end of 1878, Alice Grady McCree was the most credentialed botanical authority in New Mexico territory, which was not saying much in absolute terms, but which mattered enormously in the specific terms of the territory, and which provided her a degree of institutional legitimacy that made both her work and her marriage more secure. The unknown plant from the hollow received its formal species description in December of 1878 through the collaborative effort of Alice's documentation and Dr. Mortensen's institutional standing. The species was named Penstemon aliciae in recognition of the discoverer, which was the first instance of a plant species being named for a woman in the territory's natural history record. Alice read the letter from Mortensen twice at the kitchen table of the McCree house, which was her house now, which she had spent the autumn months organizing and reorganizing, and making her own in the specific way that she did everything, thoroughly, attentively, with full acknowledgement of what was already there and judicious additions of what was needed. Ira was watching her read the letter. "Well," he said. She set the letter down and looked at him. "They named it after me," she said. He smiled. It was a full smile, not the restrained, near smile she had seen first, but the real one she had been seeing more and more, the one that did something significant to his face and to her chest simultaneously. "Of course they did," he said. "Penstimen Alice," she said, trying the sound of it. "You are going to say that Latin out loud every day for the rest of the year," he said. "Probably," she agreed. He came and sat beside her at the table and picked up the letter and read it. His hand found hers while he read, the way it did now, easily and without remark, as if they had been finding each other's hands for years. Winter came to the high desert territory with a particular beauty. The mountains went white, the grassland went frost-pale and amber, and the spring hollow filled with a silence that was different from any other silence Alice had ever known. She went there still, regularly, even in the cold, sometimes alone and sometimes with Ira. The plants were dormant, but the spring still ran, and she began a winter pattern survey that she expected would take 3 years to complete. In February, she realized she was expecting a child. She told Ira on a cold morning when the frost was still on the window glass, and the kitchen stove was throwing a warm circle of heat into the room. She told him directly and with full composure because that was how she told things. He sat with the information for a long moment. Then he stood up and crossed the room and held her in a way that was different from any previous embrace, tighter, more anchored, as if he were establishing something. "Are you frightened?" he said into her hair. She thought about it honestly. "A little," she said. "In the practical sense, there is a great deal I do not know about the process." "We will learn it," he said. "Yes," she said, "we will." Spring came early to the territory in 1879, which Alice documented carefully because the early spring timing had implications for the grassland phenology she was tracking. The hollow was the first place to show green, as she had predicted. The Penstimen Alice flowered in late April, 3 weeks before the general surrounding landscape, and she sat beside it one afternoon with her notebook on her knees and her belly round and significant under her jacket, and wrote the most detailed phenological observations she had yet produced. Ira found her there in the early evening when he came looking because she had missed supper and was not where she had said she would be. He stood at the entrance of the hollow and looked at her, his wife, sitting in the hollow with the late flowering plant she had discovered and named beside her, her head bent over her notebook, entirely absorbed. He had a lantern in his hand, and the amber light of it mixed with the last of the natural light, and she looked up and saw his face. He was looking at her with the expression that had no name that she had yet found adequate. She thought about it sometimes, the inadequacy of available words for the specific quality of Ira McCree looking at Alice Grady McCree with full knowledge of who she was and full choice in the matter. "I missed supper," she said. "You did," he said. "I was at a critical observation point," she said. "I know," he said, and came to sit beside her. She showed him the notebook entry. He read it carefully, as he read everything she showed him now, because he had discovered that her observations reliably contained things worth knowing, and because it was a form of being close to her that he had come to value specifically. "The early flowering suggests the microclimate is warming ahead of the regional trend," he said. "Yes," she said. "If I can document this across 3 years, it may be indicative of a broader pattern. And if it is, then it has implications for planting calendars, water management, and possibly the grassland composition predictions I have been building since last summer." She looked at the flower. "Small signals, long implications. That is how most things work," he said. She leaned against him, which was a thing she did now with the comfortable ease of someone who had completely let go of the reserve that had always been her first presentation. He put his arm around her, and they sat in the hollow in the last of the evening light with the endemic flower and the alkaline spring, and the whole dark blue immensity of the New Mexico sky beginning overhead. "I have been thinking about names," she said. "For the baby," he said. "Yes. Not botanical names," he said firmly, but with the quality of a man who is not entirely sure he will win this point. "Not botanical names," she agreed with the tone of a woman who had already considered and rejected this option on her own terms. "I was thinking James after my father, or Thomas." "James," he said, trying it. "James McCree." "If it is a boy," she said. "What if it is a girl?" she thought. "Clara," she said. "My grandmother." "James or Clara McCree," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I like both." James McCree was born in June of 1879, a solid and emphatic baby who announced his arrival in the world with impressive volume, and whose eyes, when they opened, were the particular dark shade of his father's. Ira held him with the careful, deliberate concentration of a man handling something irreplaceable, and Alice watched him from the bed with the specific, exhausted love of the newly delivered and thought, "Here it is. The full inventory of what this territory has given me. The land, the hollow, the plant that bore her name. The warrant dissolved, the injustice at least partly exposed, the letters sent and answered. The man with the dark eyes and the 8 years of alkaline water knowledge and the careful, thorough, wholehearted love. And now James." Mrs. Hennessy came the following day with food and unsolicited advice about infant care, most of which was outdated, and some of which was actively counterproductive. And Alice listened to it with the polite attention she gave everything, and then implemented the recommendations she found plausible and quietly disregarded the rest. Mrs. Hennessy suspected this was happening, but was too fond of Alice to press the point. The summer of 1879 was the most productive year of Alice's botanical survey, which was remarkable given that she was nursing an infant for most of it. She had arranged a system involving a specific carrying cloth that kept James secured against her body while she worked, which allowed her hands to remain free and her eyes to remain forward. Ira, who was managing a particularly demanding seasonal cycle of ranch work, sometimes found her in the middle pasture with the baby asleep against her chest and her notebook active in both hands, writing one-handed in the practiced shorthand she had developed specifically for field conditions. He did not find this remarkable. He found it completely her. The Territorial Botanical Survey, formally established by the end of 1879, contracted Alice as a primary contributor for the New Mexico section. It was not a large contract financially, but it gave her formal standing and access to the institutional resources she needed for the longer-term projects. She was, by all measures, one of the most productive field botanists in the region, and the unusual combination of her formal training and her access to working ranch land gave her a perspective that the purely academic contributors could not match. She was also, by this point, known in Cimarron as herself rather than as anyone's wife, which was a distinction she valued without being combative about it. She was Alice McCree in every social and domestic context and Alice Grady for her scientific publications, and the two names coexisted in her life without contradiction, the way the two plants in the hollow, the widespread tansy aster and the endemic Penstemon allicii, coexisted without competition. Ira read every one of her published papers, even the highly technical ones, working through the Latin nomenclature with the same steady method he applied to everything. He had a working botanical vocabulary now that would have surprised most people who met him, which was a fact she found privately and thoroughly delightful. Their second year of marriage saw the resolution of the last outstanding business from the Keegan affair. The Federal Land Commissioner's inquiry concluded with formal findings that documented the fraudulent water rights scheme, identified 9 affected families who had been wrongfully displaced from land access, and recommended a restitution process. It was not a complete resolution. The affected families had already lost years of use, and the restitution was partial, but it was formal acknowledgement of the wrong, which mattered both in principle and in practical terms. Alice had been expecting the outcome, and had been in contact with two of the affected families throughout the inquiry, helping them document their claims and navigate the formal process. When the commissioner's letter arrived with the final findings, she brought it to Ira and they read it together at the kitchen table. "It is not enough," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it is something." "Yes," he said, "more than there was before." She looked at the document. "I am going to write to the affected families directly," she said, "and copy the letter to the territorial representative in Santa Fe, because the restitution process needs to be actively monitored or it will languish." "I know," he said. "And I am going to write a paper," she said, "for the Land Survey Journal about the relationship between water rights documentation and botanical survey indicators. Because the same plant patterns that let me read this land are the patterns that can establish prior use and occupancy in disputed territories. The science and the law can actually speak to each other." He looked at her. "You have been thinking about this for months." "Since last autumn," she admitted. "Since I realized the water rights case and the phenology survey were drawing on the same underlying data." "Alice," he said, and the way he said her name was still the full version, not abbreviated, not casual, always her whole name spoken with the quality of someone who chose the word carefully. "What would have happened to this land and this hollow and the people here if you had come on a different stage?" She thought about it. "The spring would still be here," she said. "The plant would still be flowering. The Keegan warrant would still be active. The affected families would still be without documentation." She looked at him. "You would still be working the fence line alone." "Yes," he said. "I did not come to this territory to be a heroine," she said. "I know," he said. "I came because I wanted to see the flora and because I was running out of places to be myself in Philadelphia," she said. "Everything else was just attentiveness, paying attention to what was actually there." "That is the thing about you," he said. "You see what is actually there. Not what someone told you to see, or what you expected to see, or what was convenient to see." She looked at him for a moment. "You do the same thing." "I learned it from the land," he said. "Before you came, I learned it from the land. You just gave me the language for it." That sentence stayed with her for a long time afterward. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned specimens, examining it from different angles, looking for what it could tell her. She thought it was possibly the most accurate description of what they were to each other, two people who saw the same world clearly and had given each other language for what they saw. James was walking by autumn of 1879, unsteadily but with enormous determination, which Ira said was purely his mother's character expressed in miniature, and which Alice did not dispute. He was taken to the hollow for the first time in October, bundled against the early cold, and he sat in the sandstone entrance with wide eyes and looked at the spring and reached for the Penstemon Aliciae stems with both hands. "Not yet," Alice said, redirecting the reaching hands. "When you are old enough to hold a pencil, I will teach you to draw them." Ira, watching from behind her, said nothing but felt everything. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was a hard one for the territory, cold coming early. A late snow in October that damaged livestock across the region, feed prices rising sharply. The McCree Ranch managed it better than most because Ira had been reading the land long enough to prepare, and because Alice's phenological observations from the previous 2 years had given them an early indication of the coming hard winter from plant timing signals. They had stocked adequately, and the cattle came through in reasonable condition. Some of their neighbors did not fare as well. There were 3 ranch failures in the surrounding area that winter, men who had overextended on land or cattle and found themselves unable to sustain the losses. Alice organized with Mrs. Hennessy a community supply-sharing arrangement that kept 2 of the smaller operations from collapsing entirely. It was practical and unflashy, exactly the kind of intervention she was good at, identifying what was available, what was needed, and the most efficient pathway between the two. She was pregnant again by the spring, which she announced to Ira on a morning in March when the snow was still on the mountain peaks, but the hollow was already showing the early green that indicated the spring below was warming. "James is not yet walking properly," Ira observed. "He is walking fine," she said. "He simply has opinions about direction." Ira looked at her with the smile that was still, 2 years later, enough to shift the temperature of any room. "A second McCree with opinions about direction," he said. "It appears to be heritable," she agreed. Their daughter, Clara, was born in November of 1880. She had Alice's coloring and Ira's jaw and the specific alert quality in her eyes that both of them recognized as essentially, thoroughly their child. James, at 17 months, investigated her with the scientific attention of a young person who has been raised by a botanist and has learned that close observation is the appropriate response to new phenomena. "He is her already," Ira said, watching James carefully touching Clara's hand. "He is curious," Alice said. "It is his best quality." "Second best," Ira said. "He has your eyes." Alice looked at him. "That is the most sentimental thing you have ever said to me." "I have been saving it," he said. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full. Not without difficulty, not without worry, not without the ordinary and extraordinary challenges of building a life on working land in a territory that was young and rough and beautiful and hard, but full. Alice continued her survey work, adding to the territorial record year by year, and her reputation grew steadily enough that, by 1882, she was receiving correspondence from botanists in Washington and correspondence about the Penstemon Aliciae discovery from European natural history institutions that were working on North American plant taxonomy. She answered every letter promptly and thoroughly, from the kitchen table in Cimarron or from the field, as circumstance required. Ira's ranch expanded modestly and productively. He added a small herd of sheep to the cattle operation in 1881, partly for practical diversification, and partly because Alice had noticed that the sheep-grazed land sections showed different plant composition patterns, and she wanted to study the comparison. He would never have admitted to anyone except Alice that this was a factor in the decision, but she knew, and he knew she knew, and that was entirely satisfactory. James turned 4 in the summer of 1883 and spent most of it in the hollow with his mother, being taught the names of things. He had a particular facility for the Latin, which Alice found interesting from a developmental perspective, and which Ira said was simply the result of having been read botanical names aloud since infancy. "Penstemon," James said carefully, looking at the pale flowers. "Penstemon Aliciae," Alice confirmed. "Named for me." "You found it," James said. This was a matter of pure fact to him. He had no conception of it as remarkable. "Yes," she said. "Papa knew it was here," James said. Alice looked at her son. He was, she realized, entirely correct. Ira had been walking this land for 8 years before she arrived. He had known the hollow was here. He had known the spring was unusual. He had not had the language for what it contained, but he had known that it was there and had brought her to it and had watched her give it words. "Papa knew it was here," she agreed. "I named it," she told Ira that evening. He listened to the story of their son's observation with his characteristic stillness and then said, "He is right." "He is 4, she said. "Smart 4, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the summer dark was settling over the territory, and through the window the mountains were visible as a blue-black mass against the starrier dark of the sky. "Do you remember the first day?" she said. "In the wagon, when you mentioned the saltgrass by the alkaline spring." "I remember," he said. "I had been making assessments and writing notes and building patterns for 24 years, she said, "and I had never had anyone just already know the thing, already be there with the knowledge, just needing the language." She paused. "That was when I started." "Started what?" he asked. "Being in love with you," she said. "I did not know that was what it was yet, but that was when it started." He moved from across the room to where she was sitting and sat beside her and put his arm around her in the easy way of 2 years of marriage and said, "For me it was the laugh." "The laugh," she said, "at the fence line. The first one." You laughed and it went out into the evening and I thought, I am in serious trouble. She laughed now, remembering. The saltgrass laugh. The saltgrass laugh, he confirmed. They sat in the quiet of their house, James asleep in his room, Clara in the small bed in the corner with the summer dark outside and the mountains present and the land all around them that they had learned together, that carried their attention like water carries minerals, quietly and invisibly and with permanent effect. In the fall of 1883, the Territorial Survey published Alice's long paper on botanical indicators and water rights documentation. It was a technical paper, but it had clear applied implications, and within 6 months it had been cited in 3 land dispute proceedings in the territory. The commissioner in Santa Fe wrote to say it was the most practically useful piece of botanical work he had encountered in his tenure. Alice read the letter twice, and then filed it in the folder she kept for official correspondence and went back to her field notes. Ira asked her once, much later, if she wished she had been somewhere else. A university, a laboratory, a formal institution. She thought about it for a long time before answering. No, she said, I think the work is better for being done here. In the actual land, not away from it. She paused, and I would have missed you. You would have missed the hollow, he said without quite hiding the smile. I would have missed you and the hollow, she said firmly, in that order. He accepted this without comment, but she saw the quality of his expression afterward, the warm, specific look she had learned to read as well as she read the soil and the grass and the alkaline spring indicators. The look that said, I know what I have. I have always known what I have. I just did not expect it, and the unexpectedness is still with me, and I am grateful for it every single day. Alice Grady McCree had come to New Mexico Territory in the summer of 1878, because she needed somewhere to be herself and had run out of room in the place she came from. She had arrived without fear, which had surprised everyone who expected her to need protecting. She had named every plant before the man beside her could point to one, and in the naming had found the shared vocabulary of a life she had not imagined and could not have planned. She had not been afraid of the wild country. She had been waiting for it. In the spring of 1884, when Alice was helping James press specimens, and Clara was sitting on the kitchen floor with a handful of dried grasses that she had apparently decided needed examining, Ira came in from the pasture with a small bunch of early flowers, not wild, for once, but deliberately chosen from the first growth around the house, something he had noted she had not yet added to the spring survey. He set them on the table beside her notebook. She looked at them, then at him. Lomatium dissectum, she said, fernleaf biscuitrute. It is one of the earliest spring foragers for bees in the high desert. I know, he said. He sat across from her. I looked it up. She looked at the small flowers. Then she looked at her husband, and she saw in his face the same thing she always saw, the man who had been reading this land before she arrived, who had brought her to the hollow, who had held the first thing that was entirely his and entirely hers with the gentleness of someone who understood irreplaceable things. Ira, she said. Yes. I am going to need a larger notebook. He smiled. I know, he said. I ordered one from Santa Fe. It arrives next week. She reached across the table and took his hand and held it, and James looked up from his specimens with the analytical expression of a child of botanists and said, Are you being sentimental, Mama? And Alice said yes, and Ira said yes, and Clara put a dried grass stem in her mouth and looked at all of them with perfect 4-month-old equanimity. And outside the window, the New Mexico Territory spring moved through the land they had learned together, naming itself in every living thing. The Penstemon Aliciae bloomed that year earlier than it ever had before, and Alice wrote the date in the margin of her notebook, with the kind of attention she gave everything total, precise, and entirely in love with what it meant.